This is ManuS, and welcome back to the second part of the review of the white cards for Ravnica Allegiance here on my channel. So let's get started with part 2. Okay, so first we have Ministrant of Obligation. The card basically is a premium limited uncommon in my book, maybe even more than just premium, could also be close to a bomb depending on how the format plays out, but probably not, since the front side is just a bit underwhelming, but I think it's going to be a pretty strong limited card for sure. The 2/1 on the front side should find some value somehow, and then turning it into 2/1/1 flyers is a pretty great deal. Just remember, like, what was it, Midnight Haunting or something, like the 3-mana instant from the original Innistrad that made 2/1/1 flyers, and this is very comparable and potentially even better. So good, in fact, that it is possible that it could see some play in Constructed. In Standard, not 100% sure though if there will be a place for it, but the power level is at a point where I think it is at least worth considering for Constructed. Next we have Brawling Caracal. Not much to see here, not a constructed card, just a limited 2-drop. It's a 2-cost 3/1. Not sure how well it's gonna play out in the format in the end, with all these Afterlife 1/1s punishing it, for example. That's definitely a bit of an issue, but yeah, it could still end up being a pretty solid 2-drop. A bit too early to tell without knowing how the format's gonna look. But yeah, just keep an eye out how well it lines up with things, because these 2-cost 3/1s are either pretty good in limited or just barely playable because they trade with so many poor things that they otherwise wouldn't. Next we have Rally to Battle. This seems like another pretty strong limited uncommon to me. Creatures you control get +1/+3 until end of turn, untap them. So this seems like a pretty good combat trick, since it works fine offensively and is a pretty massive blowout defensively. It costs 4, so it's kind of telegraphed in a way, but it's also really powerful and not that easy to play around, I suppose. So it seems like a fairly strong card in limited, and making it a pain for the opponent to attack and block as long as you have 4 or more mana open. Not a constructed card though. Next we have Resolute Watchdog. It's a 1-cost 1/3 defender, making it actually a pretty solid blocker in limited. As a 2-cost non-defender, it would also be a fine card, so a 1-cost defender that should block or trade with all or almost all of the 2-drops in the format, and maybe some creatures past that. Seems pretty decent. And for 1, you can sacrifice Resolute Watchdog, and target creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. So you can also cash it in later to save a better creature, which makes it scale pretty well into the game, which is important with a 1/3 defender, which will get outclassed after a few turns. So all in all, seems like a very solid limited card, but probably nothing else. Next we have Sentinels Mark. Another decent limited trick. Basically, since it has flash, it's kind of an instant and gives one of your creatures +1/+2 and vigilance. The vigilance, if you play it as a trick, will not really matter. But as we all know, thanks to the fact that it has flash, it's a trick with upside that leaves the creature permanently buffed, which is pretty good. So seems like a very solid trick in limited, and the addendum gives it some added flexibility, using it as a non-trick just offensively on a bigger creature to just gain some life back with lifelink and swing a race in your favor, or create like a very obnoxious offense-defense flyer, for example. A bunch of nice options here, which I think is gonna make the card a pretty solid or even good to great uncommon in limited. Once again, not a constructed card though. Next we have Sky Tether, another uncommon. For 1 white, enchanted creature has Defender and loses flying. So basically a reverse demotion. Demotion keeps the opposing creature from blocking. This keeps it from attacking, while also taking away the flying, which makes it a bit worse at blocking. So yeah, basically if your deck either is attacking in the air, like I said, the blue-white skies type strategies, or if your deck is defensive enough, this seems like a pretty nice way of pseudo-dealing with an opposing threat in a very efficient manner. Just gotta be careful to not get blown out by things like the blink spell that we talked about in the last part, and similar cards that yeah, could deal with this main deck. So yeah, but all in all, it should be a decent card. Not too great though. Next we have Smothering Type. This card basically going to be really bad in limited, and even in constructed in general it won't be particularly good, I think, but there might be a way to kind of abuse this and break this. So we'll have to see if there's some kind of cool combo with this card that breaks it, but without basically breaking the card. I think the card is not very good. Next we have Spirit of the Spires. Amazing limited 4-drop, 2/4 flying for 4 is already very solid, and then also giving your other flyers +1 toughness is really nice. This is a premium pick in limited for sure, no matter whether you're Aldrov or Azorius. Then we have Summary Judgement, another more defensive interaction. So Azorius has this weird mix of some fairly aggressive cards and tricks, and these very defensive removals, so we'll have to see how it plays out in the end. But yeah, it deals 3 damage to a tapped creature as an instant, and if you play it as a sorcery during your main phase, it deals 5 damage to that creature instead. Or rather, keep in mind you can technically use it as an instant in your main phase and still deal 5, so this deck doesn't have to be empty, it doesn't have to play, has to be played as an actual sorcery just in your main phase. So yeah, seems like a very good removal in limited for more defensive decks, kind of like, what was it, Swift Reckoning, I think? A bit more limited, but always an instant if you need it to be, so that's nice. Then we have Syndicate Messenger, another very solid draft common, not a constructed card once again. A 4-cost 2/3 flyer is decent, a bit below the curve, but the fact that it has Afterlife 1 basically makes up for that, making this a very solid to good common 4-drop in limited. Then we have 10th District Veteran, a 3-cost 2/3 vigilance, and when it attacks you get to untap another target creature you control. So there's some potential to abuse this with yeah, creatures that have good activated abilities that they tap for, and past that it's basically just giving one of your other creatures pseudo vigilance, which is neat. Like, it seems like a pretty solid 3-drop, nothing exciting, nothing to write home about, but a very decent 3-drop for a lot of limited decks, offensive and defensive alike. Then we have Tastetaker, another card that is pretty interesting for constructed even in modern. It costs a white and 1, is a 2/1, and even has Afterlife 1, which is a really nice bonus. But the big deal, especially in modern, will be during your turn, spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast, and abilities your opponents activate cost 1 more to activate, unless they are mana abilities. But not sure how much play it's gonna end up seeing in modern. The fact that it is a human definitely helps, and that it only costs a single white, but we have Grand Abolisher in limited in modern already, and that's basically a straight up better version of this. It costs double white, it's a 2/2, doesn't have Afterlife, but instead of making the opponent's effects more expensive, it just completely locks them out. So in Modern it is probably going to be outclassed in the end, but it might be a bit more main deckable, something like Humans, the way it is, but it still probably just affects too little. So yeah, not too likely. But in Standard, since we don't have a better version, this seems like it could be a pretty good card in Standard. For example, it makes Settle the Wreckage cost 5 against White Winnie, which is a pretty noticeable impact, because they might not always be able to win before Settle the Wreckage on 4, but a Settle the Wreckage on 5 suddenly seems much more beatable, even on the draw. So yeah, I expect this to be to make some form of splash in Standard, in white aggro decks at least, or at least as a sideboard card. And in Limited, I mean, a 2-cost 2/1 with Afterlife 1 seems like a very reasonable 2-drop. Not great, but very playable. And for the last 3, we have Twilight Pender, a 1-cost 1/2 that for black mana you can give Death Touch until end of turn. Nothing impressive, but a fine blocker. It blocks some of the 1-attack creatures, and then later you can just trade it with one of their big ground threats, making it a fine filler for more defensive out of decks. Then we have Unbreakable Formation. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn, and if you cast this spell during your main phase, put a +1/+1 counter on each of those creatures, and they gain Vigilance until end of turn. Another card that could be interesting for Standard, since yeah, indestructible means it can protect you from some of the sweepers. The problem right now is that a lot of the sweepers do not destroy, like Finality gives -, isn't affected by this. Settle the Wreckage, not affected by this. But there are still Cleansing Over, and what was the other one? Ritual of Suit. So there are cards that are affected by this, and the fact that this also has some pretty nice offensive capabilities might make it show up, at least in some sideboards, as like a 1 or 2 of maybe. We will see. 3 is still a bit clunky, and given that it doesn't even address all of the most common sweeper effects, it might just fall by the wayside, unless somehow the card ends up being main deck worthy enough. But I feel like the card quality and density is too high for this card to be yeah, main deckable, but not entirely sure. In Limited, however, this seems like a fairly strong finisher, a bit similar to something like an Overrun. Obviously less of a stat boost, but the fact that it provides Vigilance and Indestructible makes it really hard for the opponent to block, effectively dealing a similar amount as Overrun would potentially, and also if they don't want to, they can only jump block in a lot of cases. And last but not least, or rather least in this case, we have Watchful Giant. It's a 6-cost 3/6. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 human creature token. Yeah, clearly not a constructed card, and even in Limited, honestly, this is pretty underwhelming, but might end up being okay as a one-off in certain decks, just to like lock up the ground, stall out, or defensive stuff, but all in all, not a very good card in terms of cost to effect ratio. Alright, that concludes the review of the white cards. Hope you guys enjoyed it as usual. Let me know in the comments what you think. Hit the like button if you did. Share it with your friends, and please subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification icon to not miss out on future content. I'll be back tomorrow with the first part of the blue cards. One last thing, if you want to help support the free content, please consider whitelisting YouTube in your ad block. That would really help a lot. You can also find me on social media and live streaming on Twitch. You can find all of this down in the description below. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm your host ManuS. I see you next time.